My golden child brother destroyed my grandfather's heirloom, so I exposed his inappropriate relationship. Female text. My brother has been the golden child since birth. My parents desperately wanted a son, and when he arrived, I ceased to exist. The neglect was severe. I'd go hungry because he wanted seconds. Girls are meant to be skinny anyway, my mother would say, taking my plate. My birthdays passed uncelebrated while his were extravaganzas. He'd parade his presents knowing I got nothing. He was a bully too, leaving bruises my parents ignored. At 16, I asked for just one birthday celebration. A cake, dinner at a restaurant. They agreed. I booked a table for 4, hopeful. My birthday came. No cake. At 5 p.m., they announced they were taking my brother go-karting. Order yourself pizza. They left before I could respond. That night, I packed everything and moved to my grandfather's house. When my parents discovered I'd left, my mother's response was lukewarm. If that's what you want. We didn't speak for 7 years. I saw them next at grandfather's funeral. My brother was 21, no license, no job, high school dropout, living at home, with a 16-year-old girlfriend. I wore grandfather's watch to the funeral. He'd left it to me. Priceless. Irreplaceable. My mother noticed immediately. That looks expensive. You should sell it. Give the money to your brother. He needs a place for him and his girlfriend. No. Months passed. Then Mom called, wanting to visit, promising not to mention money. I reluctantly agreed. The dinner went well, but that night the watch was gone. I called Mom. She denied it until I bluffed about security cameras and pressing charges. Your brother took it to sell it. Return it tomorrow or I press charges. She arrived the next day with the watch, destroyed, cracked, mangled. I hope you're not too angry, my brother smirked. I accidentally dropped it. I exploded, screamed until neighbors came out. They fled. I found someone to fix the watch, but I couldn't let this go unpunished. I messaged my brother's girlfriend on Instagram, sent photos of the destroyed watch, explained our history, asked if she thought a 21-year-old dating a 16-year-old was normal. She thanked me and left him. My family bombarded me with rage, called me vengeful, worse names. The girlfriend had revealed he was physically and sexually abusive. I was considering reporting him to police when something else happened. My cousin Lori called. She never contacts me. Golden child's cousin, parents' favorite niece. We need to talk about your grandfather. What about him? Did he ever tell you about the watch? Just that it was a family heirloom. There's more. After the funeral, I was helping clear his house. Found documents in his safe. About you. What documents? Adoption papers. Medical records. Police reports. My blood went cold. Adoption? You're not their biological daughter. You're not even related to them. That's impossible. Your grandfather wasn't your grandfather. He was your biological father. I couldn't breathe. What? Your real mother was a teenager he had an affair with. She died giving birth. He paid your parents to raise you as theirs. Why would they agree to that? Money. Lots of it. Monthly payments for 18 years. But there was a condition. They had to treat you equally to their biological children. They didn't. I know. That's why the payments stopped when you were 10. Your grandfather found out about the neglect. The payment stopping coincides with when your birthdays stopped being celebrated. But why did he let me stay with them? The documents show he tried to get custody. Courts wouldn't give it to him. So he waited until you were old enough to choose. The watch. Look inside the back panel. There's something hidden. I carefully opened the damaged watch's back panel. Inside was a tiny key and an engraved message. For my daughter. The truth is in box 447. Box 447? Safety deposit box. The bank documents are in the papers I found. I drove to the bank immediately. The key fit. Inside were documents, photos, and a letter. The photos showed my grandfather with a young woman. She looked exactly like me. The letter was dated a week before his death. My dearest daughter, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry I could never tell you the truth. Your mother was Emily Rosario, 17 when we met. I was married, weak, selfish. When she died giving birth to you, I was a coward. I paid my brother and his wife to raise you, thinking it was best. Watching them abuse you while taking my money was my greatest shame. The watch isn't just an heirloom, it contains evidence. Your brother isn't their biological son either. He's their nephew, son of your mother's sister who died of an overdose. They've been collecting survivor benefits fraudulently for 13 years. The evidence is all here. Make them pay. Love, Dad. I looked at the documents. Fraud, embezzlement, false claims totaling hundreds of thousands. But the last document stopped my heart. A DNA test, dated 3 months ago, between my grandfather and my brother. My brother was my grandfather's son too. My half-brother. My grandfather knew. The paper had a note attached in my grandfather's handwriting. He knows. Has always known. Check his girlfriend's birth certificate. I pulled up the girlfriend's social media. Found her last name. Searched public records. The 16-year-old girl my brother was dating. Emily Rosario. Named after her grandmother. My mother. My brother was dating our half-sister. And from grandfather's note, he knew exactly who she was. I sat in my car outside the bank for 20 minutes. staring at the documents spread across my passenger seat. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold my phone. My brother knew Emily was our half-sister and dated her anyway. That made him not just a predator, but something far worse. I needed to call someone, but every person I could think of felt either unsafe or wrong for what I'd just discovered. Lori was the only one who might understand. She'd started this whole thing by finding grandfather's documents. I pulled up her number and pressed call before I could change my mind. She answered on the second ring. I told her about the DNA test and the note about my brother knowing Emily's identity. She went completely silent for almost 30 seconds. Then she whispered that we needed to get Emily away from him immediately. Her voice sounded scared in a way I'd never heard before. She asked where I was and said she'd drive over right now. I told her I was still at the bank parking lot. She said to stay there and she'd be there in less than an hour. Lori arrived in 45 minutes. She parked next to me and got into my passenger seat, pushing the documents aside carefully. We sat there reviewing every paper from the safety deposit box. We created a timeline of grandfather's discoveries and the evidence he'd collected. The fraud documentation was so detailed it made me sick. It showed monthly payments my parents received and falsified benefit claims they filed after my mother's sister died. They'd been claiming my brother as their dependent when he was actually their nephew. The numbers kept adding up higher and higher. Lori pointed out dates and amounts, her finger tracing lines across bank statements. We realized the payments stopped exactly when I turned 10. That was when my birthdays stopped being celebrated. That was when everything got worse. Grandfather had found out about the neglect and cut them off, but he couldn't get me out of there. The court documents showed he'd tried 3 times to get custody. All 3 times he was denied. We spread everything across both of our laps and the dashboard. Lori pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of each document. She said we needed backups of everything in case something happened to the originals. I watched her photograph page after page, bank statements, benefit claims, forged documents, DNA results. The evidence against my parents were massive, but the worst part was the note about my brother. Grandfather had written it just weeks before he died. He'd known my brother was dating Emily. He'd known my brother understood exactly who she was. The note said to check Emily's birth certificate, which I'd already done. Emily Rosario, named after her grandmother, after my mother, after the woman who died giving birth to me. Lori looked up from the documents. She said we were dealing with multiple crimes here: fraud, embezzlement, false benefit claims, and my brother's knowing relationship with his minor half-sister. Her voice got quiet when she said that last part. She suggested we needed a lawyer before doing anything else. One wrong move could mess up potential criminal cases or put Emily in more danger. I hadn't thought about that. I'd been so focused on the horror of what I'd discovered that I hadn't thought about how to handle it properly. Lori was right. We needed professional help, someone who knew how to navigate this kind of situation, someone who could protect Emily and make sure my parents and brother actually faced consequences for what they'd done. I spent the rest of the day on my laptop researching family law attorneys who handled fraud cases. I read review after review, looking for someone who wouldn't judge the complete mess my family had become. Some lawyers specialized in divorce. Some handled custody battles. I needed someone who could deal with fraud and criminal cases and family secrets all at once. By evening, I'd narrowed it down to 3 lawyers. I sent inquiry emails to all of them, explaining that I had evidence of long-term fraud and needed urgent consultation. I didn't mention the incest part in the emails. That felt like something to discuss in person. I wasn't sure I could even afford legal help. The money I'd been saving was for a new car, not lawyers. But I couldn't navigate this alone. Lori had already gone home, promising to help however she could. I sat in my apartment staring at my phone, waiting for responses that probably wouldn't come until tomorrow. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept cycling through everything I'd learned in the past few hours. I wasn't who I thought I was. My entire identity had been a lie. My parents weren't my parents. My grandfather was my father. My brother was my half-brother. And he was worse than I'd ever imagined. Not just abusive and manipulative, but deliberately targeting our shared half-sister. My parents had been criminals for over 20 years. They'd taken money meant for my care and used it for themselves and their golden child. They'd committed fraud and embezzlement and let me starve while they threw parties for him. The watch sat on my nightstand where I'd placed it after getting home. I kept looking at it in the darkness. Grandfather had waited until he died to tell me the truth. Why hadn't he fought harder while he was alive? Why had he let me suffer for years when he knew what was happening? I understood he'd tried to get custody. But 3 attempts and then he just stopped? He just waited for me to turn 16 and run away on my own? Part of me was grateful for the evidence he'd left. Part of me was angry he hadn't done more. My phone rang at 8 in the morning. I'd finally fallen asleep around 5 and the sound jolted me awake. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. I answered anyway. A woman's voice introduced herself as June Lockhart. She was one of the lawyers I'd emailed. Something about her direct tone made me feel like she could actually handle this situation. She didn't waste time with small talk or pleasantries. She said she'd received my email and wanted to offer a free consultation that afternoon. Could I come to her office at 2? I agreed immediately. I asked if I could bring someone with me. She said of course. I texted Lori right away. She responded within minutes saying she'd meet me there. June's office was in a plain building downtown. Lori and I walked in together at exactly 2 o'clock. The receptionist led us to a conference room where June was waiting. She was maybe 50, with short gray hair and glasses. She shook both our hands and gestured for us to sit. I had brought all the documents from the safety deposit box in a folder. I laid them out on the table and started talking. I told her everything. My childhood neglect, the destroyed watch, finding out about the adoption, the safety deposit box, the fraud evidence, my brother's relationship with Emily. June's face stayed professionally neutral the entire time, even when I described my brother dating his own half-sister. She took detailed notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she started asking questions. What evidence did I have versus what did I suspect? Could I prove my parents knew about the fraud? Could I prove my brother knew Emily's identity? How much documentation did I have of the childhood neglect? I realized how much I was going to need to prove. Having documents wasn't enough. I needed to build actual legal cases. June explained that I was dealing with several separate but related legal issues. First, the fraud case against my parents. That involved government benefit programs, so it was both state and federal. Second, the criminal case regarding my brother and Emily. That was statutory rape at minimum, possibly incest, depending on how prosecutors wanted to charge it. Third, my own identity questions about birth certificates and legal parentage. She said each of these would require different approaches and different evidence. She recommended her husband Derek, who was a private investigator. He could help gather additional evidence before we approached authorities. She also said I should start therapy to process everything while pursuing legal action. Courts and officials would take me more seriously if I was actively addressing my own trauma. I hadn't thought about therapy. I'd been so focused on justice that I hadn't considered my own mental health. But June was right. I needed to be stable and credible if I was going to take on my entire family in court. I hired June right there in her office. I used the money I'd been saving for a new car. It hurt to spend it, but this was more important than transportation. June said she'd start working on a strategy immediately. Her first priority was confirming Emily's identity and current safety. That meant I needed to figure out how to contact her without alerting my brother. I still had her Instagram from when I'd messaged her before about my brother's age. But June warned me that approaching Emily directly could be seen as interference or harassment. We needed to be strategic about how information reached her. Maybe through her grandmother. Maybe through school counselors. Maybe through social services. June said Derek would help figure out the best approach. She scheduled another meeting for 3 days from now, after Derek had time to review all the documents and start his investigation. Lori and I left the office feeling like we'd actually taken a real step forward. We had professionals helping us now. We had a plan. It still felt overwhelming and terrifying, but at least we weren't doing this alone anymore. The next morning, Derek showed up at June's office with a leather messenger bag full of equipment. He spread the documents from the safety deposit box across her conference table and started photographing each page with a high-end camera that made soft clicking sounds. Lori and I sat on the other side watching him work, his movements quick and organized like he'd done this 1,000 times before. He explained that he'd create digital backups of everything and store them in 3 separate locations, so nothing could be lost or destroyed. The originals would go in June's safe until we needed them for court. He took out a laptop and started scanning documents directly into some kind of database, typing notes as he went. Every few minutes, he'd pause to examine something closer, his face getting more serious as he read through the fraud evidence. When he finished with the financial records, he looked up and said the fraud claims appeared solid on first review, but he'd need about a week to verify everything through public records and financial databases. He also said we needed to figure out if Emily had other family members who should know about the situation since she was a minor and might need protection right away. I hadn't thought about that angle. Too focused on the legal case against my parents and brother. But Derek was right that Emily's safety had to come first. He asked if I knew anything about her living situation or who was taking care of her. I admitted I only knew what I'd seen on social media and that my brother was dating her. Derek made a note on his laptop and said he'd start with basic public record searches to map out Emily's family situation. After Derek left, I went home feeling like we'd made real progress, but also overwhelmed by how much we still didn't know. I kept thinking about Emily living her normal teenage life with no idea she was in an awful relationship with her own half-brother. That night, I created a fake Instagram account using a random name and profile photo I found online. It felt wrong and creepy, like I was stalking this girl I'd never met, but I needed to understand her current situation before we did anything that might put her in danger. I started following her account and scrolling through her posts from the past few months. What I saw made my stomach hurt. She looked happy in every photo, smiling and laughing with my brother in couple pictures that seemed normal on the surface. They had inside jokes in the comments, posted about dates to movies and restaurants, shared photos from some hiking trip they'd taken together. She called him sweet nicknames and he commented heart emojis on all her selfies. To anyone looking at her account, they'd see a regular teenage girl in a relationship with an older guy. But I knew the truth underneath those happy photos. I knew he was abusing her based on what his previous girlfriend had revealed. I knew he was her half-brother, and that he'd known exactly who she was when he started dating her. I knew he deliberately targeted a vulnerable girl for reasons I couldn't fully understand. Looking at those photos where she seemed so happy and unaware made me feel sick. She had no idea what he really was, or what he was doing to her. The next day, Lori came over and we spent hours searching public records for information about Emily's family. We found her father's death certificate first, dated 3 years ago from a car accident. Then we located her mother's name and discovered multiple arrests for drug possession, with the most recent one leading to a court-ordered rehab program that she was currently in for the 3rd time. We traced Emily's current address to a house owned by someone named Margaret Rosario, who turned out to be Emily's maternal grandmother. So Emily was living with her grandmother while her mother was in rehab, and her father was dead. That explained why my brother had access to her, and why nobody seemed to be watching the relationship closely. A teenage girl with minimal family protection, and a grandmother who was probably overwhelmed trying to raise her. Lori and I looked at each other across my kitchen table, and I could see she was thinking the same thing I was. My brother had specifically chosen Emily because she was vulnerable and alone. He'd found a girl with almost no family support who was probably desperate for love and attention, and he'd used that to manipulate her into a relationship. The fact that she was also his half-sister just made it more sick and twisted. My stomach turned as I realized how calculated his actions had been. That afternoon, June called and said I needed to start therapy before we moved forward with any legal action. I pushed back immediately, saying therapy felt like something I couldn't afford to focus on right now with everything else happening. She cut me off and explained that courts and authorities would take me more seriously if I was actively working on my own stuff while reporting crimes. Prosecutors would want to know I was stable and credible, not just someone acting out of anger or revenge. Judges would look more favorably on my testimony if I could show I was dealing with my childhood in healthy ways. I argued that therapy seemed like a luxury when Emily was in danger, and my parents were getting away with fraud. June's voice got firm, and she said this wasn't optional if I wanted her help with the case. She explained that I was about to go through an incredibly hard process that would bring up every bad memory from my childhood. I'd be questioned by lawyers who would try to make me look unstable or vindictive. I'd have to face my parents in court and stay calm while they lied about me. Without therapy and support, she said I'd probably fall apart before we even got to trial. When she put it that way, I understood she was right. I agreed to find a therapist. I spent the next 2 days researching therapists online, reading reviews, and looking for someone who worked with family problems and identity issues. Most of them had waiting lists or didn't take my insurance, but I finally found Aurora Bowers, who had an opening in 3 days. Her website said she worked with people dealing with family secrets and childhood neglect, which seemed perfect for my situation. I called and scheduled the appointment, then spent the waiting time organizing all my documents and writing down everything I could remember about my childhood. I made lists of specific incidents where my parents had neglected me or favored my brother. I wrote down memories of going hungry while he ate seconds, of birthdays that passed without celebration, of bruises my parents ignored. I documented the financial timeline showing when grandfather's payments stopped and when the neglect got worse. Writing it all down made it feel more real somehow, like I was building a case not just against my parents but for my own experience. By the time my first therapy appointment arrived, I had pages of notes and memories that I'd never really let myself think about before. Aurora's office was in a small building near downtown, painted calm blue with comfortable chairs in the waiting room. When she called me back, she was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, with dark hair and a direct way of looking at me that felt honest instead of fake sympathetic. I sat down on her couch and immediately started crying before I'd even explained why I was there. She handed me tissues and waited quietly while I tried to pull myself together. When I finally started talking, everything poured out in a confused mess. I told her about finding out my grandfather was actually my father, about the fraud and the abuse, about my brother dating our half-sister and knowing exactly what he was doing. I explained that my entire identity had been a lie, and my family was worse than I'd ever imagined. Aurora listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes but mostly just paying attention in a way that felt real. When I finished, she didn't offer easy comfort or simple solutions like I'd half expected. Instead, she said something that actually helped. She explained that I could hold multiple truths at the same time without them canceling each other out. I was a victim of my parents' crimes, that was true. I was also grieving the grandfather who was actually my father, that was true too. And I had a responsibility to protect Emily even though we'd never met, that was also true. None of these things made the others less real. I didn't have to choose which truth mattered most, or which feeling to focus on. I could be angry and sad and determined all at once. Somehow hearing her say that made everything feel slightly less overwhelming. A few days later, Derek called with his initial findings. His voice sounded different on the phone, more serious than when we'd met in person. He said he'd verified through public records and financial databases that my parents had been collecting survivor benefits for my brother under false reasons for 13 years. The total amount came to over $200,000 that they'd taken from the government by claiming my brother as their biological son when he was actually their nephew. He'd also confirmed that grandfather's monthly payments to them had stopped suddenly when I was 10 years old, which matched exactly with when my birthdays stopped being celebrated, and the neglect got much worse. The timeline was too perfect to be chance. Grandfather had clearly cut off their money when he discovered they weren't treating me right, and they'd responded by treating me even worse. Derek said the evidence was strong enough to pursue criminal fraud charges, not just civil penalties. He'd compiled everything into a detailed report that he was sending to June. Listening to him lay out the facts in such clear terms made it feel more real than ever. My parents weren't just bad parents who'd neglected me. They were actual criminals who'd stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars while abusing a child they'd been paid to care for. June scheduled a meeting at her office to talk about legal strategy now that we had solid evidence. Lori came with me for support, and we sat in the same conference room where we'd first laid out all the documents. June spread out Derek's report and explained what came next. She said we'd need to report the fraud to both state and federal authorities since survivor benefits involved government programs. We'd also need to work with law enforcement about my brother's relationship with Emily since that involved crimes against a minor. She warned me that once we started this process, my family would know immediately what was happening. They'd figure out I was behind it, and their reaction would probably be bad. She asked if I was prepared for them to come after me, to spread lies about me to extended family, to possibly try to intimidate or threaten me. I said yes, even though the idea scared me. June nodded and said she'd start making the necessary contacts with prosecutors and police. She also said I should keep going to therapy because things were about to get much harder. I spent the next 2 days trying to prepare myself for what was coming. I went to another session with Aurora where she helped me practice what I'd say if my parents confronted me. We did role-playing exercises where she pretended to be my mother making accusations, and I practiced staying calm and not getting defensive. It felt silly at first, but actually helped me think through how I'd respond to their lies. Aurora reminded me that I didn't owe my parents a relationship or forgiveness just because they'd raised me. She said protecting Emily and seeking punishment for real crimes wasn't revenge. It was justice. Those were different things, even though they might feel similar. I kept repeating that to myself. Justice, not revenge. Protecting someone vulnerable, not attacking people out of anger. I was still scared about what would happen when everything came out, but I felt more ready than I had before. I had professionals helping me, evidence that proved the truth, and a clear reason for doing this that went beyond my own pain. June called on a Wednesday morning to say she'd contacted the prosecutor's office with our fraud evidence. They'd assigned someone to review the case and promised a response within 48 hours. She'd also reached out to a detective named Marlon who handled cases about minors and sexual abuse to discuss my brother's relationship with Emily. Everything was moving faster than I'd expected. June said once the authorities got involved, there'd be no way to stop or slow down what happened next. Investigations would start, people would be questioned, my family would be notified they were under investigation. I'd lose any control over the timing or process. She asked one more time if I was sure I wanted to move forward. I thought about Emily posting happy photos with my brother while having no idea what he really was. I thought about my parents collecting money for over a decade by lying about who my brother was. I thought about grandfather leaving me all that evidence because he wanted someone to finally make them pay. I told June I was sure. She said okay, and that she'd keep me updated as things developed. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment for a long time just breathing and trying to process that it was really happening. There was no going back now. Authorities were involved and my entire family was about to face real results for what they'd done. My phone rang at 8 the next morning while I was still in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened in the past week. The screen showed a number I didn't recognize and I almost ignored it before something made me answer. A deep voice introduced himself as Detective Marlon King from the county police department, saying June had contacted him about a case involving a minor and requesting my cooperation. My stomach dropped as I sat up, suddenly wide awake and gripping the phone harder. He asked if I could come to the station that morning to provide information about Emily and my brother, and I agreed immediately, throwing on clothes and driving there within 30 minutes. At the station, Detective King led me to a small interview room that smelled like coffee and cleaning products, gesturing for me to sit in a plastic chair across from his desk. He was probably in his 50s, with gray hair and tired eyes that looked like they'd seen too much, and his tone was professional but not unkind as he pulled out a notepad and pen. He started asking questions about how I knew Emily's identity, and I walked him through finding the DNA test in grandfather's safety deposit box, the note about my brother knowing, and the birth certificate information I'd found online. My voice shook as I explained that my brother deliberately pursued our shared half-sister, knowing exactly who she was the entire time. Detective King's expression got harder as I talked, his jaw tightening and his pen pressing harder against the paper. He asked specific questions about the DNA test date, what grandfather's note said word for word, and whether I had copies of everything. I showed him photos on my phone of the documents, and he nodded slowly, saying he'd need the originals as evidence. When I asked what would happen next, he said he'd need to interview Emily immediately to assess her safety and understand the full extent of the relationship. He couldn't tell me much about the legal process, but he confirmed that what my brother did was criminal on multiple levels, and they'd be building a case carefully to make sure it stuck. I left the station feeling sick, but also relieved that someone with authority was finally taking this seriously and would protect Emily from my brother. I got home around noon and was making lunch when my phone rang again, this time showing my mother's number. I stared at it for 3 rings before answering, and her voice came through sugary, sweet, and fake, asking how I was doing like we talked regularly. She said she'd been thinking about our last interaction and felt bad about how things ended, suggesting we have lunch together to clear the air and move past our disagreements. My whole body tensed because I knew she had no idea what was coming, but the timing felt weird, like maybe my brother sensed something or Lori accidentally mentioned something to another family member. I forced my voice to stay calm and said, "Sure, we could meet for lunch," and she suggested a casual restaurant near her house in 3 days. After I hung up, I immediately called June and told her about the invitation, asking if I should go or if it was too risky. June said it was actually a good opportunity to record anything my mother might admit, and she'd help me set up a legal recording on my phone before the meeting. She warned me not to reveal anything about the fraud investigation or the police involvement with Emily, just to listen and let my mother talk as much as possible. The next morning, I met June at her office, and she spent 2 hours coaching me on what to say and not say when I met my mother. She emphasized that I should listen way more than I talked, avoiding any hints about the legal actions already moving forward. June pulled up a recording app on my phone that was legal in our state for one-party consent, showing me how to start it discreetly and making sure the audio quality would be clear enough for evidence. She reminded me that anything my mother admitted could be used in court, so I needed to stay calm and not get emotional even if she said horrible things. We practiced different scenarios where June pretended to be my mother making accusations or asking suspicious questions, and I rehearsed staying neutral and redirecting without giving anything away. It felt silly at first, like we were acting out a bad movie scene, but after a few rounds, I started to understand how easily I could accidentally reveal too much if I wasn't careful. June also warned me that my mother might try to manipulate me emotionally or make me feel guilty, and I needed to remember that protecting Emily and holding criminals accountable wasn't the same as attacking family out of spite. I left her office feeling more prepared, but also more nervous, knowing I'd have to sit across from my mother and pretend everything was normal while recording her words for prosecutors. The day before the lunch, Detective King called again with an update that made my heart race. He said he'd made contact with Emily's grandmother and would be interviewing Emily the next day about her relationship with my brother. He couldn't give me details about their conversation because of privacy laws and the ongoing investigation, but he confirmed that Emily was currently safe and her grandmother was cooperating fully. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, knowing Emily would soon learn the truth, even though I knew the truth was going to destroy her world. Detective King said Emily's grandmother had been concerned about the relationship for months, but didn't have concrete reasons to forbid it beyond the age gap, and now she was grateful someone was finally taking action. He asked if I'd be willing to meet Emily eventually once she'd processed everything, since she might want to connect with her biological family and understand where she came from. I said yes without hesitation, even though the idea of meeting her filled me with anxiety about what she'd think of me and our messed-up family. 3 days after my mother called, I drove to the casual restaurant she'd picked, my phone already recording in my purse with the app June had set up. My mother was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table and waving like nothing was wrong between us. She looked older than I remembered, with more gray in her hair and deeper lines around her mouth, but her smile was the same fake, pleasant expression she always used when she wanted something. I sat down and ordered water, my stomach too twisted to eat anything, and she immediately launched into complaints about how I'd turned my back on family over one little mistake with the watch. She didn't apologize for my brother destroying it, or acknowledge the years of neglect, instead suggesting I was being dramatic and holding grudges like I always did. I bit my tongue hard and let her talk, nodding occasionally while my phone captured every word. She went on about how families are supposed to forgive each other, and how I'd always been too sensitive and took things too personally. My hands clenched under the table as she rewrote history, making herself the victim and me the ungrateful daughter who abandoned her parents for no good reason. When she finally paused to drink her iced tea, I carefully mentioned that I'd been thinking about grandfather a lot lately and wondering about family history. Her expression shifted instantly to something guarded and suspicious, her eyes narrowing slightly as she set down her glass. She changed the subject quickly, asking pointed questions about whether I'd been going through grandfather's things or talking to lawyers about his estate. I said I'd found some old photos and was just curious about the past, keeping my voice light and casual. She pressed harder, asking what kind of photos and what else I'd found, her paranoia showing through the fake sweetness. I shrugged and said just family pictures, nothing important, and watched her relax slightly but not completely. Her reaction confirmed that she knew there were secrets worth hiding, even if she didn't know yet that I'd found all the evidence grandfather left behind. The rest of lunch was tense and awkward, with her fishing for information, and me deflecting while trying not to reveal anything useful. When we finally left, she hugged me stiffly, and said we should do this more often, and I agreed, knowing it would probably be the last time we'd sit together like this before everything exploded. I drove straight to June's office after lunch and played her the recording, both of us listening to my mother's words and her suspicious questions. June said there was nothing directly incriminating on the tape, but my mother's paranoia and defensive behavior supported the overall narrative of guilt and deception. More importantly, June had filed the initial paperwork with the prosecutor's office that morning, and we should expect movement on the fraud case within the next week. She explained that once the prosecutor decided to move forward, my parents would be formally notified they were under investigation, and everything would escalate quickly from there. I asked what would happen to them if they were convicted, and June said they'd likely face prison time plus full restitution of all the money they'd stolen, which would probably mean losing their house and any other assets. The idea of my parents in prison felt surreal, but I reminded myself they'd committed serious crimes for over a decade and deserved real consequences. 2 days passed with no word from anyone, and I tried to focus on work and normal life while waiting for the next shoe to drop. Then my phone started blowing up with text messages from my brother, coming in rapid fire starting around 3 in the afternoon. The first few demanded to know what I'd said to Emily, and then they got increasingly angry and incoherent. He said Emily had stopped responding to him completely, and her grandmother wouldn't let him visit or even talk to her on the phone. His messages revealed he didn't know yet that police were involved, just that something had changed, and he blamed me for ruining his relationship. The texts got nastier with each one, calling me a jealous bitch who couldn't stand to see him happy and accusing me of lying to Emily about him. He said I'd always been a vindictive snake who tried to destroy everything good in his life, and he was going to make me sorry for interfering. The threats were vague but clear enough to make my hands shake as I read them, his rage pouring through the screen in barely coherent sentences. I screenshot every message as they came in, knowing I'd need evidence of his behavior. As soon as the messages stopped, I forwarded all of them to Detective King with a short explanation that my brother was threatening me. He called back within an hour, his voice serious as he confirmed they were building a case but couldn't share details about Emily's interview yet. He said my brother's threatening messages were concerning and advised me to block his number immediately to prevent further harassment. Detective King also suggested I vary my routine for the next few weeks and be aware of my surroundings in case my brother's threats escalated to actual stalking or physical confrontation. The idea that my brother might come after me physically was scary, but it also clarified everything I already knew about who he really was. He'd always been violent and controlling, and now he was showing it clearly to people with authority who could actually stop him. I blocked his number like Detective King suggested, then checked all my door locks and windows before going to bed that night. June called me the next afternoon with news that made my heart pound. She said the prosecutor's office had reviewed all the evidence Derek gathered and decided to move forward with fraud charges against my parents. They'd be formally notified within the next few days that they were under criminal investigation, and the case would proceed to preliminary hearings and potentially trial. June explained that I'd probably be called as a witness to testify about the childhood neglect and how it correlated with the stopped payments, which meant I'd have to face my parents in a courtroom and tell the truth in front of a judge. I said yes immediately without hesitation, knowing this was exactly what grandfather wanted when he left me all that evidence in the safety deposit box. June warned me that my parents would likely get a lawyer who'd try to discredit me or paint me as a bitter daughter making up stories, but the financial evidence was solid enough that my testimony would just support what the documents already proved. She said we'd spend time preparing me for cross-examination once we got closer to the hearing date, but for now, I just needed to be ready for my family to find out and their inevitable reaction. I thanked her and hung up, sitting in my apartment for a long time just breathing and trying to process that it was really happening, and there was no going back now. 2 days after June's call, I woke up in the middle of the night gasping for air, my chest so tight I thought I was having a heart attack. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, trying to breathe but only managing shallow gulps that made me dizzier. The walls of my apartment felt like they were closing in, and I couldn't stop thinking about my brother showing up at my door, or my parents finding some way to hurt me for what I was doing. I managed to text Aurora even though it was 3 in the morning, just typing, "Can't breathe, help," before my vision started going spotty around the edges. She called me back within 5 minutes, her voice calm and steady as she talked me through breathing exercises until the panic started to ease. She had an opening at 10 that morning and told me to come in, saying panic attacks this severe meant I needed support immediately. I barely slept the rest of the night, just lay there staring at the ceiling and trying to keep my breathing steady. Aurora's office felt like a safe space when I arrived, and I collapsed into the chair across from her desk, exhausted and scared. She asked me to describe what triggered the panic attack, and I told her about the fraud charges moving forward, and my brother's threats, and the constant fear that my family would retaliate somehow. She listened without interrupting, then explained that what I was experiencing was a normal response to abnormal circumstances, that my body was processing years of trauma on top of current threats. Aurora reminded me that I was breaking a cycle of abuse and lies that had hurt multiple generations, that my discomfort and fear didn't mean I was doing something wrong. She said sometimes doing the right thing feels terrible because we've been conditioned to protect abusers and keep secrets, but that protecting Emily and seeking justice for the fraud was exactly what needed to happen. We worked through specific fears, like what I would do if my brother showed up or if my parents tried to contact me, creating concrete plans that made me feel less helpless. By the end of the session, I still felt shaky but more grounded, like I could actually handle what was coming instead of just drowning in panic. Detective King called that afternoon while I was making lunch, and my stomach dropped when I saw his name on my phone. He got straight to the point, saying Emily now knew the truth about her biological relationship to my brother. His voice was gentle as he explained that she was devastated, but also relieved to finally have an explanation for things that felt wrong about the relationship. Emily had told him she always felt uncomfortable when my brother touched her, but couldn't articulate why, and now she understood it was her body recognizing something her mind didn't know. Detective King said he'd connected Emily with Waverly Cook, a social worker who specialized in working with teenagers who'd experienced trauma, and that Emily's grandmother was being incredibly supportive throughout everything. He paused before asking if I'd be willing to meet Emily eventually, explaining that she'd expressed curiosity about her half-siblings and biological family. My heart started racing again, but in a different way, a mix of hope and terror at the thought of meeting this girl who shared my mother's name and DNA. Detective King assured me there was no pressure and no timeline, that Emily needed time to process everything, and I should only agree if I felt ready. I told him I needed to think about it, and he said to take all the time I needed, that Emily wasn't going anywhere, and neither was the possibility of meeting. I spent the rest of that day thinking about Emily, wondering what she looked like and whether she had our mother's features the way I did. The idea of meeting her filled me with complicated feelings I couldn't quite name, like hope and anxiety and guilt all tangled together. I called Detective King back that evening and told him I was willing to meet Emily when she was ready, that I wasn't trying to replace anyone in her life, but maybe we could help each other. He sounded pleased and said he'd let Waverly know that they'd reach out when Emily felt prepared for contact. I explained that Emily and I shared a mother neither of us knew, and we were both victims of my brother's deliberate cruelty in different ways. Detective King agreed and said sometimes survivors of the same abuser found healing in connecting with each other, though it had to happen organically and with professional support. After we hung up, I looked at the photos from grandfather's safety deposit box again, studying my mother's face and wondering if Emily looked at those same features in the mirror every day. My father called me 3 days later, and I knew immediately from the prosecutor's office notification that my parents had been formally told about the fraud investigation. His voice was already screaming before I even said hello, calling me a liar and a traitor who was destroying the family over jealousy and spite. I held the phone away from my ear as he ranted, his words barely coherent as he denied everything and accused me of making up stories. I stayed quiet and let him talk, remembering June's advice about not engaging with their anger. My father's story kept changing as he yelled, first saying they never took any money, then saying grandfather forced them to take it, then pivoting to claim they had to take the money because raising me was so expensive. He said grandfather owed them for dealing with me all those years, that I was difficult and ungrateful, and they deserved compensation for putting up with me. His justifications got wilder and more contradictory the longer he talked, confirming everything I already knew about his character, and his complete inability to take responsibility. I finally interrupted to say I had nothing to discuss with him and hung up, my hands shaking but my resolve stronger than ever. I immediately opened my phone's recording app, cursing myself for not thinking to record the call while it was happening. My father called back 2 minutes later, still screaming, and this time I hit record before answering. He launched right back into his rant without any greeting, and I let him talk while the app captured every word. He admitted they'd been taking money from my brother under false pretenses, claiming it was justified because grandfather owed them and I'd been such a burden. His voice was full of rage and self-pity as he detailed how hard it was to raise someone else's kid, and how they deserved to be paid for their trouble. I asked a few careful questions that June had coached me on, getting him to clarify that they knew my brother wasn't their biological son, and that they'd been collecting benefits they weren't entitled to. My father was so angry he didn't even notice I was leading him to incriminate himself more, just kept ranting about how unfair everything was, and how I was ruining their lives over nothing. When he finally ran out of steam and hung up, I had a 12-minute recording of him admitting to fraud and justifying it by saying grandfather owed them for raising me. I sent the audio file straight to June with a message explaining what had happened. June called me back within an hour, and I could hear the excitement in her voice as she said this recording was exactly what the prosecutors needed. She explained that my father's admission strengthened the case significantly because it proved they knew they were committing fraud and felt entitled to do it. His claim that grandfather owed them for raising me actually supported my testimony about the neglect, since it showed they viewed caring for me as a burden they deserved payment for, rather than a family obligation. June said my father's anger had made him careless, and he'd handed prosecutors a gift by laying out the entire fraud scheme in his own words. She asked if I was okay after dealing with his call, and I admitted it was hard, but also clarifying to hear him confirm everything I'd always known about how they saw me. June reminded me to block my parents' numbers now that we had the recording, saying there was no benefit to further contact, and it would only cause me more stress. Lori called me the next morning with a warning that extended family members were starting to take sides in the situation. Her voice was apologetic as she explained that some relatives believed my parents' version of events, that I was a vindictive liar trying to steal money and destroy the family over old grudges. She said my aunt had been calling people and painting me as mentally unstable and jealous of my brother, trying to drum up support from my parents before the legal case went further. I felt hurt but not surprised, knowing from therapy and reading that people often protect abusers rather than believe victims because it's easier and less disruptive. Lori assured me she was telling anyone who asked the full truth about what she'd found in grandfather's house and what the documents proved. She said she'd shown several family members copies of the fraud evidence and grandfather's letter, and some of them were starting to question my parents' story. Lori told me not to waste energy trying to convince people who were determined to believe lies, that the legal system would prove the truth regardless of family opinion. I thanked her for having my back and told her I was grateful to have at least one family member who wasn't trying to gaslight me or protect abusers. June called a few days later with news about additional paperwork she was filing with the court. She explained she was requesting that I be legally recognized as grandfather's biological daughter, which would require amending my birth certificate and potentially changing my legal name if I wanted to. The process would involve presenting the DNA evidence and grandfather's documentation to family court, establishing the true facts of my parentage. June asked if I'd thought about taking grandfather's last name, and I admitted the idea felt right in a way my current surname never had. My whole childhood identity had been built on lies, and taking my real father's name felt like reclaiming truth and honoring the parent who actually cared about me. I told June I wanted to change my name but needed some time to process what that would mean practically and emotionally. She said there was no rush on the name decision, that we could amend the birth certificate first and handle the name change later if I wanted. Derek finished his complete investigation 2 weeks after he started, presenting me and June with a comprehensive report that laid out the full scope of my parents' crimes. The report showed falsified benefit claims going back 13 years, forged documents claiming my brother as their dependent, and financial records proving they knew he wasn't their biological son. Derek had traced every payment they'd received and documented how the amounts matched up with survivor benefits they had no legal right to collect. The report also included something I hadn't expected: copies of grandfather's attempts to gain custody of me starting when I was 11 years old. Derek had found court filings that were denied, letters to Child Protective Services that were apparently never investigated properly, and documentation of grandfather trying every legal avenue he could think of to get me away from my parents. I read through page after page of grandfather's desperate attempts to save me, feeling my throat get tight as I realized how hard he'd tried and how completely the system had failed both of us. I made an emergency appointment with Aurora after reading Derek's report, needing help processing the complicated feelings that came up. I told her about grandfather's custody attempts and how I felt this weird mix of grief that he tried to save me but failed, and anger that he didn't try harder or tell me the truth while he was alive. Aurora listened carefully and then explained that grandfather was probably paralyzed by shame about the affair and his own weakness in paying my parents instead of fighting harder from the start. She said people often make choices that seem incomprehensible from the outside, but make sense within their own framework of guilt and fear. Aurora helped me understand that grandfather's perspective was shaped by his generation's attitudes about affairs and illegitimate children, that he probably thought he was doing the right thing by keeping the secret and trying to work within the system. She reminded me that understanding his choices didn't mean I had to forgive them or pretend they didn't hurt me, just that I could hold space for his humanity, while still feeling angry about the impact on my life. By the end of the session, I felt less conflicted, able to see grandfather as a flawed person who loved me but made terrible choices, rather than either a hero or a villain. June called 3 days later with news from the prosecutor's office. They'd scheduled a preliminary hearing for the fraud case in 3 weeks, which was faster than she'd expected given how backed up the courts usually were. She explained that this hearing was where prosecutors would present their evidence to a judge who would determine if there was enough to proceed to trial. June said I'd need to testify about my childhood experiences and how they correlated with grandfather's payment stopping, which meant I'd have to face my parents in a courtroom for the first time since everything started. My stomach dropped at the thought, but I knew it was necessary, that this was what grandfather wanted when he left me all that evidence. June assured me she'd prepare me thoroughly for testimony and that I'd have support throughout the process, that we'd do practice sessions so I'd know exactly what to expect. She explained the preliminary hearing would be shorter and less formal than a trial, but it was still crucial because the judge's decision would determine whether the case moved forward. I agreed to meet with June twice before the hearing to prepare, and she promised we'd go over every possible question the defense might ask. Detective King called 3 days after the prosecutor's meeting. I saw his name on my phone screen and my hands went cold. I picked up on the second ring. He told me they were moving forward with statutory rape charges against my brother and investigating the incest angle. The statutory part was easy since Emily was 16 and my brother was 21, but proving he knew about their biological connection required solid evidence. He asked if I could bring the safety deposit box documents to his office that afternoon. I said yes and hung up feeling like I might throw up. This was really happening. My brother was going to face criminal charges for what he did to Emily. I drove to the police station with the folder of documents in my passenger seat, checking my rearview mirror constantly like my brother might somehow know where I was going. Detective King met me in a small conference room and spread the documents across the table. He photographed everything with his phone, then used a scanner to make official copies. He focused especially on grandfather's note about my brother knowing Emily's identity and the DNA test results proving we were all related. When he finished, he looked at me and said the evidence was strong enough to establish knowledge. He explained that prosecutors would argue my brother deliberately sought out Emily knowing she was his half-sister, which made the relationship not just statutory rape, but incest. I asked how long the investigation would take. He said they needed to interview Emily formally, which would happen through the social worker assigned to her case. He wrote down a name on a business card and slid it across the table. Waverly Cook, licensed clinical social worker. He said Waverly specialized in adolescent trauma and would be my contact point for anything related to Emily. I left the police station feeling like the world was moving in slow motion. Everything looked normal, but nothing felt real. I drove home and sat in my car for 20 minutes before going inside. That evening, Waverly called. Her voice was warm but professional, the kind that made you feel like she actually cared. She said Emily had been told about the biological relationship and was processing the information with professional support. Then she asked if I was ready to meet Emily. My throat closed up. I managed to say I wanted to meet her, but didn't know if that was appropriate. Waverly explained that Emily was curious about me and wanted to understand our shared history. She suggested we meet at her office where she could facilitate and make sure Emily felt safe. We scheduled it for the following week, Tuesday afternoon at 3. I hung up and immediately called Aurora. I needed an emergency session to prepare myself for meeting the half-sister I didn't know existed until a few weeks ago. Aurora fit me in the next morning, and we spent an hour talking about what I hoped for from the meeting and what scared me about it. She reminded me that Emily and I were both victims of my brother's choices, and that connecting with each other didn't require me to be anything other than honest. I left feeling slightly more prepared but still terrified. Tuesday arrived faster than I wanted. I drove to Waverly's office in a building near the community college, my palms sweating on the steering wheel. The waiting room had soft chairs and magazines nobody ever read. Waverly came out to get me right at 3. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with kind eyes and a firm handshake. She led me down a hallway to her office where Emily sat on a couch picking at her thumbnail. I stopped breathing for a second. She looked exactly like the photos of our mother from grandfather's safety deposit box. Same dark hair, same nose, same way of holding her shoulders like she was trying to take up less space. She glanced up at me and then back down at her hands. Waverly gestured for me to sit in the chair across from Emily and settled herself between us with a notepad. The silence felt heavy. I didn't know how to start. Emily didn't look up. Waverly asked Emily if she wanted to say anything first. Emily shook her head. So I pulled out my phone and opened the photos I'd saved from the safety deposit box. I turned the screen toward Emily and said this was our mother when she was 17. Emily's head came up fast. She stared at the photo and her eyes got shiny. She asked if she could hold my phone. I handed it over and watched her zoom in on our mother's face. She whispered that her grandmother had one picture of her daughter, but it was old and faded and she'd never seen this one. I told her there were more photos in the box and I'd make copies for her if she wanted. She nodded without looking away from the screen. We talked for 2 hours. Emily asked questions about what I knew about our mother, and I shared everything grandfather's letter had said. She told me about her grandmother raising her after her dad died, and her mom went to rehab. She talked about meeting my brother at a community event, and how he seemed so interested in her life and her family history. My stomach turned hearing how he'd asked specific questions about her grandmother's maiden name and her family tree. He'd been hunting for confirmation that she was Emily Rosario before he even started dating her. Emily's voice got quieter when she described their relationship. The way he isolated her from friends, the way he'd get angry if she talked to other guys, the way he pressured her into things she wasn't ready for. I recognized every pattern she described. He'd done the same things to me when we were kids, just in different ways. Targeting vulnerabilities, creating dependence, making you feel like you deserved the bad treatment. I told Emily about my childhood with him and she started crying. Not loud sobs, just tears running down her face while she kept talking. She said she felt stupid for not seeing what he was doing. I told her she wasn't stupid. He was a predator who knew exactly how to manipulate people. Waverly added that abusers are skilled at making victims blame themselves, and that Emily's feelings were normal but not accurate. By the end of the session, Emily was sitting forward on the couch instead of curled into herself. She asked if we could stay in touch. I said yes immediately, and we exchanged phone numbers right there. She added me on social media before leaving Waverly's office. Walking to my car, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Emily and I were both survivors of the same family dysfunction, and knowing each other existed made the truth feel less isolating. June called the next day to start preparing me for the preliminary hearing. She explained we needed to practice my testimony so I'd be ready for hostile questions from my parents' lawyer. We scheduled 3 sessions over the next 2 weeks. The first one was in her office conference room. She sat across from me with a legal pad and asked me to walk through my childhood chronologically, focusing on specific incidents of neglect. I started with the earliest memory I had of going hungry while my brother got seconds. She wrote everything down and asked follow-up questions about dates, witnesses, physical evidence. Then she switched roles and became the opposing counsel. Her voice got sharp and skeptical. She asked why I waited so long to report the abuse. She suggested I was making things up for attention or money. She implied my parents were loving caregivers and I was an ungrateful daughter. My chest got tight and I struggled to answer calmly. June stopped and told me that was exactly what would happen at the hearing. The defense lawyer would try to make me emotional and defensive because that undermined credibility. She coached me to take deep breaths between answers, stick to facts without elaborating, and redirect hostile questions back to documented evidence. We practiced for 2 hours until my voice was steady, even when she asked the worst questions. I left exhausted, but more confident that I could handle the real thing. 2 weeks before the hearing, a letter arrived from my mother. The envelope had her handwriting and my stomach dropped seeing it. I almost threw it away without opening it, but curiosity won. Inside were 3 pages of her handwriting, small and cramped. She wrote that she'd always loved me and done her best despite difficult circumstances. She claimed grandfather had made impossible demands and threatened to take me away if they didn't meet his standards. She said they struggled financially and had to make hard choices about resources. She never once mentioned taking his money or committing fraud. She never acknowledged the neglect or my brother's abuse. Instead, she painted herself as a victim of grandfather's control and my unreasonable expectations. The letter made me feel sick. It was pure manipulation, rewriting history to avoid responsibility. I took photos of every page and sent them to Aurora. She responded within an hour, asking if I could come in that afternoon. I drove straight to her office and we spent the session dissecting the letter line by line. Aurora pointed out every gaslighting technique, every deflection, every lie disguised as an explanation. She helped me see that my mother's version of events contradicted documented facts, and that her refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing proved she hadn't changed at all. By the end of the session, I felt clear-headed instead of confused. My mother's letter wasn't an apology or an attempt at reconciliation. It was a legal strategy designed to make me doubt myself before the hearing. Detective King called on a Thursday morning. His voice sounded tired but satisfied. He told me my brother had been arrested on statutory rape charges after Emily gave a formal statement detailing their relationship. The incest charges were still under review by the prosecutor's office, but the statutory rape case was solid. My brother had been taken into custody that morning and was processed. I asked what happened next. Detective King explained there would be an arraignment where my brother would enter a plea. Then he'd either make bail or stay in custody pending trial. He warned me that my parents would probably pay his bail, and that my brother would likely be released within 24 hours. I thanked him and hung up feeling a complicated mix of satisfaction and dread. My brother was finally facing consequences, but he'd be out soon and probably angrier than ever. Detective King's prediction was right. My brother made bail the same day, paid for by my parents. But he couldn't leave well enough alone. Within hours of being released, he created a fake social media account and tried to contact Emily. She recognized his writing style immediately and reported it to Waverly, who contacted Detective King. Violating a restraining order while out on bail was serious. Detective King called me the next morning to say my brother had been arrested again. This time, bail was set much higher because he'd proven he couldn't follow court orders. My parents couldn't afford it without selling assets, and they hesitated with the fraud case looming over them. My brother sat in jail for a week while they scrambled to come up with the money. I felt a grim satisfaction knowing their golden child was costing them everything they'd stolen over the years. The morning of the preliminary hearing arrived cold and gray. I put on the most professional outfit I owned and drove to the courthouse with my hands shaking on the wheel. June and Lori met me in the parking lot. Lori hugged me tight and told me I could do this. June reviewed the key points of my testimony one more time. We walked into the courthouse together and went through security. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lights. My parents sat at a table with their lawyer, a man in an expensive suit who looked bored. They didn't turn around when I entered. They sat rigid and still, staring straight ahead. The prosecutor was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression. She nodded at me as I sat down behind her table. The judge entered and everyone stood. The preliminary hearing started with the prosecutor laying out the charges against my parents. Multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, false benefit claims. She presented documents methodically, walking through grandfather's payment records, the stopped payments when I was 10, the falsified survivor benefit claims for my brother. The forensic accountant testified about the paper trail showing deliberate fraud over 13 years. My parents' lawyer objected repeatedly, but the judge overruled most of them. Then it was my turn to testify. I walked to the witness stand and swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor asked me to describe my childhood. I told the truth about the neglect, the hunger, the ignored birthdays, the favoritism toward my brother. I explained how everything changed when I turned 10, how the abuse got worse after that. I described finding the safety deposit box and learning about grandfather's payments stopping at exactly that time. The prosecutor showed me documents and I confirmed what they proved. My parents' lawyer stood up for cross-examination. He asked why I waited until now to report the neglect. I said calmly that I didn't know about the fraud until grandfather's death revealed the evidence. He suggested I was a bitter daughter making up stories for attention. June objected and the judge sustained it. He asked why I moved out at 16 if things were so bad. I explained that I did move out, to grandfather's house, which proved how bad things were. He tried to paint my parents as loving caregivers who made normal parenting decisions. I stayed calm and redirected every question back to documented facts. The stopped payments, the fraud, the evidence grandfather collected. The lawyer got frustrated when I wouldn't get emotional or defensive. After 20 minutes, he gave up and sat down. The prosecutor did redirect, giving me a chance to clarify that I wasn't seeking revenge. I said I wanted accountability for documented crimes and protection for other victims like Emily. I explained that this wasn't about bitterness. It was about justice. The judge thanked me and I stepped down. My legs felt weak walking back to my seat, but I kept my head up. June squeezed my shoulder when I sat down. The prosecutor rested her case and my parents' lawyer made a motion to dismiss that the judge denied immediately. The judge said there was more than sufficient evidence to proceed to trial on all charges. She set a trial date for 3 months out and adjourned the hearing. My parents stood up slowly, looking smaller and older than I remembered. My father tried to approach me in the aisle, but June stepped between us and said if he came any closer, she'd report him for witness intimidation. He backed off, his face red with anger. Lori and I walked out of the courthouse into the cold air, and I took my first deep breath in hours. The judge straightened her papers and looked down at us from the bench. She said there was more than enough evidence to move forward with a trial on all the fraud charges. My parents would face multiple felony counts. She set the trial date for 3 months from now. My mother's face went white, and my father gripped the table edge so hard his knuckles turned pale. They stood slowly when the judge dismissed us, looking smaller somehow, like they'd shrunk in their seats. Lori squeezed my hand as we gathered our things. June packed her briefcase with smooth, practiced movements. We filed out of the courtroom into the hallway where other people waited for their own cases. My parents walked ahead of us toward the exit. I kept my eyes forward, focusing on the door at the end of the hall. We made it outside into the parking lot before my father turned around. He started walking toward me, his face red and twisted. June stepped between us immediately. She told him if he came any closer, she'd report him for witness intimidation. Her voice was calm but sharp. My father stopped walking, but his eyes stayed locked on mine. The hatred in them was so clear it made my stomach turn. He'd never looked at me like that before, not even during the worst times when I was a kid. This was different. This was pure rage mixed with something that looked like fear. He turned away finally and walked to their car with my mother following behind him. I watched them drive away, my hands shaking in my coat pockets. 3 days later, Detective King called while I was at work. I stepped outside to take the call in the cold air. He said the prosecutor's office was adding incest charges against my brother. The DNA evidence from grandfather's safety deposit box proved the biological relationship. Grandfather's notes showed my brother knew exactly who Emily was when he started dating her. The case was getting more complicated legally, but they felt confident about pursuing it. My brother's lawyer had already started making noise about plea deals. He might be willing to plead guilty to lesser charges to avoid trial. I asked what that would mean for Emily. Detective King said they'd have to see what the prosecutor recommended and what Emily wanted. He reminded me that Emily's wishes mattered most in this situation. I thanked him and hung up. My hands were still shaking when I went back inside. The prosecutor called me 2 days later asking me to come in for a meeting. She wanted to discuss my thoughts on a potential plea deal for my brother. I drove to her office that afternoon. She was younger than I expected, maybe in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back tight. She asked me directly if I wanted my brother to take a plea deal or go to trial. I told her the truth. I wanted him to face full consequences for what he'd done. I wanted him punished for knowingly dating our half-sister and abusing her. But I also didn't want Emily to have to testify if it would hurt her more. The prosecutor nodded and made notes. She said she respected my input, but Emily's wishes would be the main factor. She explained that they'd only offer a plea if it served justice and protected Emily. If Emily wanted to testify, they'd let her. The prosecutor said she'd be meeting with Emily and Waverly next week to discuss options. I left feeling like I'd said what I needed to say, but knowing the decision wasn't really mine to make. June called me that evening while I was making dinner. She wanted to go over trial strategy for my parents' fraud case. We talked for over an hour. She sounded confident about winning based on the documents and my testimony. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, falsified benefit claims, the forensic accountant's analysis. Everything pointed to deliberate fraud over many years. June warned me that my parents would probably try to paint themselves as victims. They'd claim grandfather manipulated them or forced them into the arrangement. But their own financial records contradicted that story. The forensic accountant would testify about the paper trail showing they knew exactly what they were doing. June said the accountant's testimony would be devastating for them. I asked what would happen if they were convicted. She said they'd face prison time, probably several years, plus they'd have to pay back all the money they'd stolen. Over $200,000. They'd lose their house, their savings, everything. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness hearing that. A week later, Detective King called again. My brother had rejected the plea offer. He apparently thought he could win at trial, or that Emily wouldn't actually testify. Detective King's voice had an edge to it when he told me. He said it was typical of abusers to underestimate their victims. They always thought they could manipulate the situation or talk their way out of consequences. My brother's arrogance was staggering but not surprising. He'd gotten away with everything his whole life. Why would he think this time was different? Detective King said the criminal trial for my brother was scheduled for 2 months after my parents' fraud trial. Everything was moving forward whether my brother believed it or not. I kept seeing Aurora twice a week during this whole period. We worked on separating my identity from all the lies I'd been raised with. She helped me understand that I could build a sense of self based on truth instead of my parents' version of who I was supposed to be. One session, she asked me what family meant to me now. I didn't have a good answer. She said that was okay. She said I got to choose what family meant. Biology didn't force me to maintain relationships with people who'd hurt me. I could create my own family with people who actually cared about me. People like Lori and Emily. The idea felt both freeing and sad. I'd never have a traditional family. No parents who loved me. No brother who protected me. But maybe I could have something better. Something honest. Aurora said I was making progress. I didn't always feel like I was, but I trusted her. The fraud trial started on a cold morning in early March. I met June outside the courthouse at 8. Lori was with me for support. We went through security and found our way to the courtroom. My parents were already there with their lawyer. They didn't look at me when I walked in. The jury was selected quickly. 12 people who decide my parents' fate. The prosecutor gave her opening statement laying out the fraud charges. She explained how my parents had collected survivor benefits for my brother under false pretenses for 13 years. How they'd falsified documents and forged signatures. How they'd taken money from grandfather with the condition of treating me equally, then violated that agreement while keeping the payments. The forensic accountant testified on the first day. He walked the jury through financial records showing every fraudulent claim my parents had filed. He showed bank statements proving they'd deposited the money and spent it. He explained how they'd created fake documents to support their claims. His testimony took most of the day. My parents' lawyer tried to poke holes in his analysis but couldn't. The numbers were too clear. Day 2 brought more witnesses. People from the benefits office explaining their procedures. Police officers who'd investigated similar fraud cases. Each person added another layer of evidence. On day 3, I testified. I described my childhood again. The neglect, the hunger, the ignored birthdays. I explained how everything got worse after I turned 10, exactly when grandfather's payments stopped. I showed the jury documents proving the timeline matched. My parents' lawyer barely cross-examined me this time. He asked a few weak questions about my memory and my motives. I stayed calm and redirected back to the facts. The prosecutor did a brief redirect and I stepped down. The defense tried to argue my parents had been manipulated by grandfather. They called character witnesses who said my parents were good people, but they couldn't explain away the financial records or the falsified documents. The evidence was too strong. The jury got the case after lunch on the 3rd day. June said it wouldn't take long given how clear the evidence was. She was right. 4 hours later, we got called back to the courtroom. The jury had reached a verdict. My heart pounded as we filed back in. The judge asked the jury foreman to stand. Guilty on all counts. Multiple felonies. Fraud, embezzlement, false benefit claims. My mother made a small sound, but my father sat completely still. The judge thanked the jury and set a sentencing date for 6 weeks later. My parents were released pending sentencing, but their bail conditions were strict. I walked out of the courthouse feeling lighter than I had in months. It wasn't triumph exactly. More like relief. Justice had happened. The truth had won. That didn't erase the damage they'd caused, but it meant something. 6 weeks later, my brother's trial started. The courtroom was packed this time. Emily's grandmother was there. Waverly sat with them. Lori came with me again. June wasn't involved in this case, but she came anyway to support me. The prosecutor laid out the charges in her opening statement. Statutory rape because Emily was 16 and my brother was 21. Incest because they were half-siblings and he knew it. Child abuse for the physical and emotional harm he'd caused. Emily testified on the 2nd day. She wore a simple blue dress and kept her voice steady. She described how they'd met, how he'd pursued her, how he'd isolated her from friends and family. She talked about the abuse without going into graphic detail, the way he'd controlled what she wore, who she talked to, where she went, the way he'd hurt her physically when she didn't obey, the way he'd made her feel like everything was her fault. She cried a few times, but she didn't break down. She was stronger than I'd expected. The DNA evidence came next. The prosecutor showed the test results proving Emily and my brother were half-siblings. She showed grandfather's notes documenting that my brother knew Emily's real identity. She showed text messages between them where my brother had made comments about family and blood that only made sense if he knew the truth. His defense lawyer tried to argue he didn't really understand the biological relationship, that he was confused or mistaken, but the evidence was too clear. Grandfather's notes were dated months before my brother started dating Emily. The text messages showed he'd researched her family background. He'd known exactly what he was doing. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Witness after witness testified about my brother's behavior. Emily's friends talked about how he'd driven them away. Her teachers noticed bruises. A neighbor had heard them fighting. The prosecutor built a comprehensive picture of deliberate abuse by someone who knew he was committing incest with a minor. My brother's lawyer couldn't overcome the evidence. The jury deliberated for a day and a half. When they came back, the verdict was guilty on all charges: statutory rape, incest, child abuse. My brother's face went pale. The judge denied bail pending sentencing, calling him a danger to minors. 2 bailiffs handcuffed him and led him away. I watched him disappear through the door and felt something like peace. Emily was safe now. Other potential victims were protected. My brother would finally face real consequences for his actions. I looked over at Emily sitting with her grandmother and Waverly. She was crying, but she looked relieved. We made eye contact across the courtroom and I nodded. She nodded back. We'd both survived him. That meant something. 2 weeks passed in a blur of meetings with June and sessions with Aurora. The sentencing hearing for my parents arrived on a cold Tuesday morning. I sat in the courtroom gallery with Lori beside me, watching my parents enter through the side door with their lawyer. They looked smaller somehow, older. My father's shoulders hunched forward like he was carrying something heavy. My mother walked with her chin up, her face set in that familiar hard expression I'd seen my whole childhood. The judge entered and everyone stood. My legs felt shaky, but I stayed upright. The judge was a woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back tight. She looked at my parents over her reading glasses as everyone sat down. The prosecutor presented a summary of the fraud charges and the evidence. My father stared at his hands the whole time. My mother looked straight ahead at nothing. When the judge asked if they had anything to say before sentencing, my father stood up slowly. His voice cracked when he spoke, saying he was sorry, that he'd made terrible choices, that he never meant for things to go so far. He cried, actual tears running down his face. My mother didn't stand. She sat there with her arms crossed. The judge acknowledged their ages, noting they were both in their late 60s. But then her voice got harder. She talked about the severity of the fraud, how it had gone on for 13 years, how they'd stolen money meant for vulnerable people. She said the duration and deliberate nature of their crimes couldn't be overlooked. 3 years in prison for each of them, followed by 5 years probation. Full restitution of $214,000 plus penalties and interest. They'd have to sell their house to pay it back. My father broke down completely, sobbing into his hands. My mother's face stayed hard and bitter. She looked at the judge like this was all some terrible mistake, like she was the victim here. The bailiffs came to take them into custody. My father could barely walk. My mother went quietly, her back straight, still refusing to accept what she'd done. My brother's sentencing hearing happened 3 weeks later. Emily came with her grandmother and Waverly. I sat on the opposite side of the courtroom from them, but we made eye contact when they walked in. Emily looked nervous but determined. She wore a simple gray dress and kept her hands folded in her lap. My brother was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked around the courtroom like he was searching for allies. His eyes landed on me and his expression twisted into something ugly. The judge was a different one this time, a man in his 50s with a stern face. The prosecutor laid out the charges again: statutory rape, incest, child abuse. The evidence of his knowledge that Emily was his half-sister. The text messages showing how he'd researched her background. His lawyer tried one last time to argue that he didn't fully understand the biological relationship, that he was confused. The judge cut him off, saying the evidence was clear and the jury had spoken. When asked if he had anything to say, my brother stood up. He didn't apologize. He said he'd been set up, that I'd manipulated everyone, that Emily had lied about everything. His voice got louder and angrier until the judge told him to sit down. The judge's voice was cold when he delivered the sentence. 8 years in prison. He cited the deliberate nature of the crimes, the fact that my brother had specifically targeted a vulnerable minor, his complete lack of remorse. Upon release, he'd have to register as a sex offender for the rest of his life. That would limit where he could live, where he could work, everything. My brother's face went pale. He started to say something, but the bailiffs were already moving toward him. Emily was crying quietly, her grandmother's arm around her shoulders. After they took my brother away, Emily and I met outside the courthouse. She hugged me, something I hadn't expected. She said she felt like she could finally start healing now that he couldn't hurt anyone else for a long time. I told her I was proud of her for testifying, for being so brave. Her grandmother thanked me for bringing the truth to light. We stood there in the cold for a few minutes, not saying much, just being together in the relief of it being over. June helped me start the legal process of being recognized as grandfather's biological daughter. There were forms to fill out, documents to file, court appearances to establish paternity even though he was dead. The DNA evidence from the safety deposit box helped. So did the letter he'd written. The whole process took months. I decided I wanted to take his last name as my own. My current last name belonged to people who'd never been my real family. Changing it felt like reclaiming something, like honoring the parent who'd actually cared about me even if he'd done it imperfectly. 3 months after the trials ended, the new birth certificate arrived in the mail. I opened the envelope alone in my apartment. My hands shook as I pulled out the official document. There it was in black print, my real father's name listed where my fake father's had been before. I sat on my couch and cried. It was grief and relief all mixed together. Grief for the father I'd lost. Relief that I finally knew the truth about who I was. Emily and I started meeting regularly over the following months. Coffee shops mostly. Sometimes walks in the park near her grandmother's house. We talked about our mother, sharing the little bits we each knew. I had the photos from the safety deposit box. Emily had stories her grandmother remembered. Our mother had been artistic, loved to draw. She'd been funny, made people laugh even when things were hard. She'd gotten pregnant at 17 and died bringing me into the world. Neither of us had known her, but talking about her made her feel more real. Emily's grandmother welcomed me into their home. She said she was grateful Emily had a positive connection to her biological family after everything. We'd have dinner together sometimes, the three of us. It felt strange at first, like playing at being a family, but gradually it started to feel more natural. Emily and I were both in therapy, working through our separate traumas. Having each other helped. We understood things about each other that other people couldn't. The complicated legacy we'd inherited, the family built on lies and abuse, the way our brother had hurt us both. We texted almost every day, checking in, sharing stupid memes, just being sisters in whatever way we could figure out. The restitution money from my parents started coming through in chunks as they sold their house and liquidated assets. I used part of it to pay for therapy for both Emily and me. Aurora had been helpful but expensive, and now I could afford to keep seeing her long-term. Emily found a therapist who specialized in adolescent trauma. June helped me set up a trust fund for Emily's college education. Our mother never got the chance to go to college, died before she could do anything with her life. Using the money my parents had stolen to invest in Emily's future felt right. It was breaking the cycle, taking something corrupt and making it into something good. June walked me through all the legal paperwork, making sure the trust was set up properly, so Emily would have access to it when she turned 18. The money wouldn't fix what had happened, but it could give Emily opportunities our mother never had. Lori became one of my closest friends through all of this. We talked almost as much as Emily and I did. She felt guilty sometimes for being the one to find the documents, like she'd caused all the pain that followed. I kept telling her she'd saved both me and Emily by bringing the truth to light. If she hadn't found those papers, my brother would still be abusing Emily, and I'd still be living in ignorance about who I really was. Lori decided to pursue a degree in social work. She said Waverly had inspired her, the way Waverly had supported Emily through everything. Lori wanted to help other families dealing with secrets and abuse. I was considering law school myself. Watching June work, seeing how her advocacy had made such a difference in achieving justice, made me think maybe I could do something similar. Help other people who'd been lied to and hurt by the people who were supposed to protect them. We'd meet for lunch and talk about our plans, our futures. It felt good to think about the future instead of being trapped in the past. A year after grandfather's funeral, Emily and I visited his grave together. We brought flowers, white roses, because Emily's grandmother said our mother had loved white roses. The headstone was simple, just his name and dates. We stood there in silence for a while. I'd read his letter so many times I had parts of it memorized. Emily had read it too, sitting in my apartment one afternoon, crying as she got to the end. We both understood better now why he'd struggled to tell the truth while he was alive. Shame, fear, weakness. He'd been human and flawed. We wished he'd been braver, wished he'd told us the truth before he died, but we also knew his final act of leaving the evidence had saved us both. Emily said she was grateful he'd documented everything about my brother. Without that evidence, she might still be trapped in that relationship, still being hurt. I agreed. His truth-telling had come too late to save our childhoods, but it had protected our futures. We placed the flowers on his grave and stood there a little longer before walking back to the car. I'm rebuilding my life now with a clearer sense of who I am. Family doesn't mean what I thought it meant growing up. It's not about blood or obligation. It's about people who genuinely care about your well-being. Lori texts me good morning most days. Emily sends me photos of her art projects. June checks in to see how I'm doing. Aurora helps me process the hard days when everything feels like too much. The legal battles are finished. My parents are in prison. My brother is locked up where he can't hurt anyone. Emily is safe and healing with real support around her. I still have hard days when I think about everything I lost, everything I learned, days when the weight of it all feels crushing. But I'm moving forward. I have honest relationships now. People who see me for who I really am instead of who they wanted me to be. I broke free from a family built on lies. I chose truth and justice even when it was terrifying and painful. That means something.